Prepare to dive into one of the most riveting showdowns you've ever heard about. A seemingly unremarkable retired trucker named Harriet and her fierce, military-trained dog, Bravo, square off against a ruthless biker gang terrorizing a quiet town. Picture a nighttime raid lit by sudden floodlights, the roar of motorcycles echoing through dusty streets, and the heart-stopping moment when Harriet steps forward, sidearm in hand, to protect everything she holds dear. This story delivers a thrilling blend of strategy, courage, and loyalty that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Want to know how a small, unassuming community can unite and how a single person's hidden strengths can change their fate? Stick around for the entire tale to find out. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to support our channel and catch all our exciting news stories. Harry Saunders had always considered herself a nomad at heart. She had spent more than half her life on the road, hauling freight across state lines in a massive 18-wheeler. Now in her late 50s, she found a rare kind of peace in a small, unassuming town called Greystone Junction, a place that most travelers overlooked or simply passed by on their way to bigger destinations. Yet for Harriet, Greystone Junction offered tranquility that was exceedingly hard to come by in her earlier years. Its dusty roads and wide-open farmland brought her an unspoken comfort, as if each breeze carried memories of a life well-traveled. Retired from trucking and living on a modest pension, Harriet kept to herself. She preferred the quieter corners of the local diner in the mornings, sipping strong black coffee that matched her determined spirit. She always wore a worn leather jacket, an unassuming color that blended in with the dusty brown palette of the region. Anyone who glanced at Harriet would see a sturdy, silver-haired woman with faint lines of worry and wisdom etched across her face. But they would likely not suspect the hidden layers beneath that calm facade. Greystone Junction itself was nothing more than a smattering of buildings along the highway. There was a small auto repair shop, a cafe, and a single motel that might see 2 or 3 occupants a night. The farmland beyond these buildings stretched for miles, dotted with wooden fences and the occasional grazing cattle. Local folks rarely locked their doors, as the biggest threat was usually a stray coyote getting too close to the chicken coops. Occasionally, a lost trucker would wander into town, only to realize they had taken the wrong exit or missed a turn. The entire place breathed an almost old-fashioned sense of safety, but Harriet knew that appearances could be deceiving. She had served 10 years in the military before her career behind the wheel. Her final tour had involved transporting crucial supplies through hostile territory, where she'd learned defensive tactics that had nothing to do with big rigs or cargo manifests. She also had a partner during some of those missions, a military-trained K-9 named Bravo. The bond between them had grown unbreakable over time. After her discharge, she had used every connection and every resource she had to adopt Bravo. It was a complicated bureaucratic process to secure the dog's retirement, but Harriet's persistence paid off. Now Bravo lived with her, hidden away in a small cabin a few miles outside town, a place Harriet had inherited from a distant cousin. When Harriet first rolled into Greystone Junction with Bravo, folks simply assumed she was another aging trucker who decided to settle down in a quiet place. The dog, a large Belgian Malinois with intense brown eyes, often stayed out of sight except on the occasional morning walks. She kept her business private, never going into detail about her years in the service or the specialized skill set that Bravo possessed. Instead, she found fulfillment in her daily routines: morning coffee at the diner, an afternoon stroll around the edges of town, and an early bedtime. What no one knew was that Harriet's tranquil life, and indeed Greystone Junction's peace, were both on the brink of an unwanted disturbance. Rumors had begun circling that a biker gang was marking new territories all along the highways of the southwestern states. The newspapers Harriet glanced at suggested the gang had grown more brazen, stirring trouble wherever they planted their boots. Harriet dismissed these whispers at first, clinging to the hope that small towns like this one would go unnoticed. After all, Greystone Junction hardly seemed like a place worth claiming. She had no inkling that these outlaws would eventually find a reason to stop by, or that her own quiet existence would soon collide head-on with their malevolent plans. 2 days after Harriet first caught wind of a biker gang known as the Iron Runners, a peculiar tension settled over Greystone Junction. People noticed new tire tracks in the dirt, fresh scuffs and scrapes on the main road, And even the local mechanic, Earl, had muttered something about strange folks passing through and asking too many questions. Harriet paid close attention to these observations. Though she seemed dismissive on the surface, she made a mental note of every suspicious event, filing them away like pieces of a puzzle that was slowly coming together. On an overcast morning, Harriet was at the diner, sipping her usual coffee. Old Matt, who ran the place, approached her table with a concerned look. "There have been rumors," he said softly, placing a second mug on her table as though she might need a refill to handle what he was about to say. "Some folks saw a group of bikers up at the old rest stop near Route 89. They've been asking about property lots for sale, cheap lots. They're also poking around, claiming they represent some investment company. But the men who saw them swear these bikers look more like trouble than investors." Harriet arched an eyebrow, quietly stirring her coffee. "Property?" she repeated. "In these parts?" The puzzling thought was that land around Greystone Junction wasn't exactly known for its high value. It was mostly farmland, rocky in places, and the roads out were not easy to navigate for big caravans or commercial expansions. Why would a biker gang show any interest here? Matt shrugged, clearly uneasy. "I don't like it," he admitted. "Some folks are spooked. Rumor says they might be planning to take over the old trucking depot and turn it into some kind of hub for their operations. Greystone's small, so maybe they think law enforcement is spread thin." That idea caused Harriet's insides to tighten. Memories from her military trucking days flickered in her mind. The dusty roads of a war-torn region, the unexpected ambushes, the need to always have eyes on the horizon. She forced herself to keep a steady expression. "Let's hope it's just talk," she said, finishing her coffee. But deep down, she felt an unsettling pang of intuition that said otherwise. Outside the diner, Harriet noticed an unfamiliar motorcycle parked near the curb. It was sleek, matte black, with a stylized skull painted on the gas tank. Around it were fresh tracks in the dust. She'd seen the bikes that normal travelers used. This wasn't one of them. Leaning against the bike was a tall figure in a black leather vest, scanning the surroundings with cold, assessing eyes. Harriet walked by, feigning disinterest. But she could sense the tension rolling off the man like heat waves. She felt the same quiet vigilance she once had in enemy territory, the same urge to reach for a sidearm she no longer carried on her hip. She hurried her pace, her boots crunching on the dirt. After passing a couple of storefronts, she reached her old pickup truck, hopped inside, and started the engine. Though she tried to maintain her composure, her heart beat more insistently than usual. Harriet had come to Greystone Junction, seeking solitude and simplicity, not another battle. Yet here she was, recalling all her training, all the times she had to stay sharp and ready. That old part of her, the soldier, began to awaken. Before driving off to her small cabin, she made one last sweep of the town with her gaze. Greystone Junction felt quiet, but not in the comforting way it used to. This was a new quiet, tinged with fear and uncertainty, and Harriet knew fear was contagious. It seeped into hearts and minds, making people doubt they were safe even in their own homes. She exhaled and gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. She also wondered if the time had come to bring Bravo more visibly into the picture. Maybe the presence of a large military-trained dog might deter a threat, or at least put Harriet on a more equal footing. That afternoon, Harriet made the short drive out of town to her cabin, passing rows of wind-bent fences and a patchwork of golden fields. By the time she arrived, she felt a deep-seated sense of urgency. She headed straight to the back door, where Bravo waited obediently. The Belgian Malinois raised its sleek head, ears perked, tail wagging ever so slightly to greet its companion. Harriet crouched down and gave Bravo a quick pat on the neck, a silent reassurance between two partners who'd shared danger before. Once inside, Harriet set about her routine. She checked the locks on her windows and doors, not out of paranoia, but out of habit formed long ago. She could practically hear the voice of her old commanding officer. "Always secure your perimeter." After that, she headed to a locked closet in the corner of her living room. Inside were a few mementos from her time in the service. A folded flag, a framed group photo, and tucked behind them, a sturdy metal case. She lifted the case gently. It contained an old sidearm, legally licensed and meticulously maintained. Harriet cradled the weapon in her hands, her expression shifting to something mournful. She'd hoped never to need it again, at least not in a quiet, unassuming place like Greystone Junction. Setting it aside, she rummaged further to find Bravo's harness in a small utility bag containing the dog's specialized gear. She also found the logbook in which she recorded Bravo's training regimen, evidence of hours spent perfecting commands, signals, and search tactics. Harriet ran her fingers over the pages, each filled with careful notations. They read like a story of mutual trust between soldier and dog. Standing up, Harriet called Bravo over, fastening the harness around the dog's chest. The harness itself had attachments for a leash, as well as pockets for small items and patches that read "Service Animal." Harriet hadn't used those patches in a while, but she placed them carefully, remembering how they had come in handy during her trucking days, especially when passing through certain checkpoints. Once dressed, Bravo sat tall, its posture radiating discipline. Stepping outside, Harriet led Bravo toward the perimeter of her land. A thick line of trees shielded her modest property from the main road. She'd chosen the location for its solitude, but now that might also allow for a safer vantage point. If the bikers decided to extend their territory in this direction, Harriet wanted to be prepared. As they walked, she tuned into every subtle sound, the wind in the branches, the crunch of pebbles underfoot. She spotted an old barn in need of repairs, a structure that had once housed her cousin's horses. That, she noted, might serve as a decent hideout if trouble came pounding at her front door. Eventually, she made her way back to the cabin, her mind swirling with possibilities. Memories of roadside ambushes, of nights spent warding off hostiles, came rushing back. She had survived far worse than a gang of opportunistic bikers, but her concern was for the town. Greystone Junction's law enforcement consisted of a small sheriff's office, 3 deputies at most, and minimal equipment. If a biker gang established a stronghold, Harriet doubted the local deputies had the manpower or training to handle it. Yet Harriet wasn't the type to sound alarm bells prematurely. She believed in caution, but also in not showing one's full hand until absolutely necessary. If these bikers were truly testing the waters, perhaps a firm show of force, her kind of force, would dissuade them. Bravo stood at her side, eyes bright with an almost eager alertness. Harriet gave the dog a final pat, took a deep breath, and resolved to face whatever came next. In a place like Greystone Junction, a single determined individual could still make a difference, especially if backed by an extraordinary companion. And Harriet intended to do exactly that. The next day, Harriet returned to town under the guise of her normal routine. She parked her old pickup truck near the diner, but decided to stroll around the block first, Bravo at her side. Just as she feared, 3 motorcycles were stationed in front of the barber shop, gleaming chrome behemoths with menacing decals. Lounging next to them were 3 bikers, each wearing a black vest adorned with a patch that read, "Iron Runners." They looked her way, lazily at first, but Harriet could tell they were sizing her up. She paused near a bulletin board that stood outside the general store, pretending to examine a flyer for an upcoming farmer's market. Her peripheral vision caught the bikers exchanging muttered words, their eyes flicking toward her and Bravo. She felt the tension coil in her gut, the same tight feeling she used to get before a convoy run in hostile territory. But outwardly, she remained composed, turning away from the board as though she'd learned all she needed to know about fresh produce. The man in the middle, tall and gaunt with angular cheekbones, took a couple of steps toward Harriet. His voice carried a mocking friendliness. "Nice dog," he said, eyeing Bravo. "Bet he's real protective, yeah?" Harriet met his gaze with a measured look. "He can be," she replied calmly. Bravo, sensing the shift in her demeanor, remained still but entirely focused on the man. "You local?" the biker pressed, his stance widening. 2 of his companions ambled closer, forming a loose semicircle. Harriet shrugged. "Close enough," she answered, refusing to give him any personal details. Her mind was already racing, considering escape routes or defensive measures. She hadn't expected a direct confrontation this soon, but she also knew her best strategy was to avoid escalating the situation. The taller man seemed amused by her vague response. "Well," he said, "we're new in town, thinking about setting up some business. You see, folks around here could use a little excitement." His grin broadened, revealing a couple of missing teeth that contrasted with his otherwise sharp features. "The Iron Runners bring excitement wherever we go." One of the other bikers, a heavy-set guy with a bushy beard, let out a low chuckle. Yeah, so if you know anyone who's got property to spare, or if you got yourself a nice chunk of land, we'd be willing to talk. We're fair when folks cooperate. Harriet nodded thoughtfully, pretending to mull it over. I'll keep that in mind, she said. She started to move, but the tall biker wasn't done. He lifted a boot and gently rested it on Bravo's flank, a careless gesture that instantly raised Harriet's hackles. Bravo stiffened at the touch, a low rumble vibrating in his throat. Harriet tightened her grip on the leash, a single subtle command to hold. This was a reckless move on the biker's part. Nobody should ever place a foot on a trained K9, especially not in a threatening manner. The tall man noticed the snarl forming on Bravo's muzzle. He smirked, then withdrew his boot slowly. Feisty, he murmured, clearly entertained. I like feisty. Without another word, Harriet turned and walked away, heart pounding. The bikers didn't follow her, but their laughter echoed behind her like a challenge. This was only their first real encounter, but Harriet sensed the danger that lay beneath their casual threats. She headed inside the diner, trying to calm herself, aware that she needed to strategize, and soon. The Iron Runners were marking their territory, and Harriet had just become an unwitting participant in their game. Inside the diner, Harriet chose a booth in the far corner, where the windows offered a clear view of the street. Bravo settled at her feet, still on high alert. Matt, the diner owner, approached cautiously, casting anxious glances outside at the bikers. You okay, Harriet? He asked quietly, placing a cup of coffee in front of her. She nodded, taking a moment to steady her breathing. For now, but something tells me they're here to stay, at least until they get what they want. She took a sip of coffee, tasting the bitterness on her tongue. We need to be ready. Have you talked to the sheriff? Matt glanced around as if the walls had ears. Sheriff Mulligan is aware, but he's outmanned. He's only got 2 deputies. They can't just arrest people for hanging around. The bikers haven't broken any laws yet, at least not openly. Harriet sighed. She knew this pattern all too well. Aggressors often probed the defenses of a place, pushing boundaries until they found a weak spot. Once they realized the local authorities were unequipped to handle them, intimidation became more blatant. Before the law could catch up, the damage would be done. She looked down at Bravo, who was still fixated on the doorway. I'll keep an eye on them, she said quietly to Matt. But I'll need help. The diner owner gave her a searching look. Help in what way? Information, Harriet replied. We need to know how many of them there are, whether they're rotating members in and out, what their patterns are. They'll likely target easy prey, small businesses or farms on the outskirts. If you hear of anything suspicious, let me know. Matt nodded gravely, his face a study in concern and hope. Harriet paid for her coffee and left, quickly making her way to her truck. She didn't see the bikers outside, which set her nerves on edge. She half expected them to jump out from behind a corner or follow her vehicle once she hit the road. Instead, the ride home was quiet. Too quiet. Back at the cabin, Harriet wasted no time. She removed Bravo's public harness and replaced it with a tactical one, better suited for a confrontation. This second harness had attachment points for a camera and compartments for small gear. She also tested Bravo's response to various voice commands, ensuring the dog's training remained sharp. She practiced the basic commands first: sit, stay, heel, then progressed to more advanced instructions, including silent hand signals that Bravo had been trained to obey in the field. Each flawless response from the Belgian Malinois reminded Harriet just how capable they both were when pressed. After the session, Harriet fetched a small notebook from her kitchen drawer and began jotting down observations. The approximate number of bikers she'd seen, 3 so far, but likely more, the type of bikes they rode, any distinctive patches or tattoos, and the location of each encounter. Then she sketched a rough map of Greystone Junction, marking potential choke points and vantage spots. Old habits from her military days died hard, and Harriet found herself slipping into the role of an intelligence officer, gathering data, assessing threats, and preparing contingency plans. She looked around her cabin, realizing just how alone she felt. This was entirely different from when she had served. Back then, there had been a chain of command, fellow soldiers to rely on, and resources. Here, in Greystone Junction, it was just Harriet and her dog, plus maybe a handful of townspeople who were more frightened than prepared. But Harriet also recognized that a single, well-trained operative could often level the playing field. Holding that thought, she gave Bravo's head a gentle rub. "Well, partner," she said aloud, her voice echoing in the quiet cabin, "it looks like we might have to remind these folks who they're dealing with." The dog cocked its head as if understanding every word. Harriet smiled grimly. She'd always tried to leave behind the battles, the adrenaline, and the violence. But if trouble had indeed come to Greystone Junction, she was ready to do what needed doing to protect her new home. Over the next couple of days, Harriet watched as the Iron Runners began to settle in like a slow, insidious, creeping vine. 3 more bikers arrived in town, making their presence known by riding up and down the main street in deafening, rumbling procession. Locals grew nervous, pulling their children inside earlier in the evening and eyeing every unfamiliar face with suspicion. The few restaurants and shops that stayed open late reported an uptick in rowdy behavior, although nothing that had resulted in overt violence. Yet, Sheriff Mulligan finally made an appearance at the diner one afternoon, seating himself across from Harriet and removing his hat with a resigned sigh. "They're testing us," he said, not bothering with small talk. "They show up at local businesses, make some snide remarks, flash their patches, but no one's pressed charges, and they haven't done anything criminal that we can nail them for. It's intimidation, plain and simple." Harriet studied the sheriff, noticing the worry lines forming across his brow. "What about the farmland they've been asking about?" she asked, leaning forward. "Surely they can't just take it without consent?" Mulligan shrugged. "They make offers, pennies on the dollar, but they threaten behind closed doors. We can't prove a threat unless a property owner files a complaint. Half the folks here just want them gone, so they try to avoid confrontation, hoping the gang will move on." His eyes flicked to Bravo, who was lying quietly at Harriet's feet. "You seem prepared, Harriet. More prepared than most." She didn't deny it. "Sheriff, if these men escalate, and I believe they will, how ready are you and your deputies?" A humorless smile tugged at the corner of Mulligan's mouth. "We're as ready as we can be, but Greystone Junction isn't exactly flush with resources. I've called the state police, but they're strapped too. They say they'll come if it gets out of hand, but you know how slow that process can be?" Harriet nodded. She did know. Bureaucracy often lagged behind real-time threats. She kept her own counsel about her military past and the extent of her training. For now, it seemed best to let Mulligan handle the formalities while she prepared for the worst. "If you need help," she said, "you know where to find me." The sheriff offered a curt nod. "I might just take you up on that. By the way, folks around here trust you, Harriet. They know you're tough, and you haven't given them any reason to doubt your intentions. Keep your eyes open." After Mulligan left, Harriet took Bravo on another walk around the outskirts of town, quietly observing the changes. The Iron Runners had added graffiti to an abandoned building near the old depot, jagged letters spelling out their gang's name, along with violent imagery that made Harriet's stomach tighten. She noticed beer cans and empty bottles strewn around, evidence of late-night gatherings. The place had the early signs of a gang's makeshift clubhouse. As dusk settled, Harriet drove back to her cabin. Halfway there, she realized she was being followed. In her rearview mirror, she saw the glint of a motorcycle's headlight, trailing at a cautious distance. Harriet gripped the steering wheel, thinking of ways to evade if needed. But the bike kept pace, never drawing too close. When she finally turned onto the dirt road leading to her property, the motorcycle slowed for a moment, then accelerated away, disappearing into the twilight. Harriet took a long breath, a swirl of conflicting thoughts in her head. The Iron Runners were watching her. Perhaps they'd seen her with the sheriff, or maybe they just didn't like the way she carried herself. Either way, Harriet couldn't afford to stay passive. The tension in her shoulders reminded her that she was drifting back into a mindset she thought she'd left behind. A readiness to fight. If push came to shove, she'd rely on every ounce of training she had. And she had Bravo. Together, they were more than a match for a few bullies on motorcycles. But would that be enough to protect not just herself, but the whole town? Night descended over Greystone Junction, cloaking the town in a quiet gloom that felt more oppressive than usual. In her cabin, Harriet double-checked all entry points. She had installed simple motion sensor lights around the perimeter, rigging them so that even the slightest movement would trigger a flood of illumination. Bravo patrolled the living room and hallway, occasionally sniffing at windows and letting out a low growl if he detected anything unusual. The synergy between Harriet and her canine partner was palpable. Each time the dog grew restless, Harriet would pause whatever she was doing to listen. Around midnight, a flash of light came from outside. The motion sensors. Harriet froze, heart thumping. She slipped her hand into the metal case near her armchair, retrieving her sidearm. Carefully, she edged toward a window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. At first, she saw nothing, just the harsh beams of the floodlights cutting across her yard. Bravo stood beside her, ears erect, posture rigid. Then a flicker of movement. A silhouette darted behind the old barn. Quietly, Harriet tapped the side of her leg. Bravo needed no further instruction, slipping into a crouch, his attention riveted on the barn. Harriet mentally traced a path to her back door, planning a silent exit. She was certain that whoever lurked out there was connected to the Iron Runners, maybe a scout or a would-be vandal. Either way, they were trespassing on her property, and Harriet intended to confront them with caution and precision. She moved swiftly, opening the back door and stepping into the darkness beyond the floodlight's reach. Bravo followed, tail still. Together, they skirted around the edges of the property, using the barn itself as cover. Harriet's mind cycled through possible scenarios: an ambush, a spy with a camera, or a petty thief thinking to mess with her truck or generator. None of these possibilities fazed her. Harriet had been in far worse situations. When they reached the corner of the barn, Harriet signaled Bravo to stay. Then she eased forward, eyes straining in the darkness. Suddenly, she spotted a figure hunched beside the barn's side entrance, attempting to jimmy the old padlock. The intruder wore a black leather vest, the skull emblem of the Iron Runners just barely visible in the moonlight. Harriet's stomach churned with anger, but she kept a clear head. She leveled her weapon in the intruder's direction, adopting a stable stance. "Stay right there," she ordered, her voice low but carrying the force of authority. "Hands where I can see them." The biker froze, then spun around, raising his arms halfway. "Hey, easy now," he muttered, trying to smirk but failing to hide the tremor in his voice. "I was just curious about your old barn. No harm done." Harriet didn't lower the gun. She heard footsteps from the other side of the barn, possibly a second intruder. Bravo's growl rumbled through the silence, and Harriet saw the shape of another figure retreating into the night. It was too dark to get a clear shot, and Harriet had no intention of chasing him blindly. She refocused on the man in front of her. "On the ground! Now!" Reluctantly, the biker dropped to his knees, shooting Harriet a venomous glare. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Some kind of retired cop?" Harriet's lip curled in a grim smile. "Something like that." She kept her aim steady, motioning for Bravo to move closer. "I don't appreciate trespassers. Now you're going to get off my property and tell your buddies to do the same." The biker smirked, attempting bravado. "You can't keep us out. We do what we want." But the sight of Bravo baring his teeth made the man's voice quake. The dog advanced, muscles coiled, ready to lunge if Harriet gave the command. Harriet exhaled slowly, controlling the adrenaline surge in her veins. "We'll see about that," she said softly. Then, in a show of silent agreement, she whistled a low note. Bravo lunged forward just enough to nip the intruder's vest, tearing the fabric. The man yelped, toppling sideways. Harriet backed up, giving him room to scramble to his feet. "Go!" she ordered, steel in her voice. The biker hesitated only a second before lurching away, stumbling over his feet as he fled into the darkness where his partner had vanished. Harriet and Bravo remained in place until the sounds of his footsteps faded into nothingness. Only then did Harriet lower her weapon, her breath escaping in a ragged sigh. She was shaken, not by fear, but by the realization that the confrontation had escalated. The Iron Runners now knew she was armed and prepared, and they would surely retaliate. Yet in that moment, Harriet felt more resolute than ever. If the gang wanted to fight, they would discover they had picked the wrong adversary. By sunrise the following day, news of the attempted break-in at Harriet's property had already spread through Greystone Junction like wildfire. Matt, the diner owner, called Harriet as soon as he opened up shop. "Harriet, you okay? Folks are saying some biker tried to get into your barn last night." She calmly explained the situation without giving too many details, especially about her sidearm. "They ran off," she assured Matt. "I'm fine, and so is Bravo. But this won't be the end of it." And it wasn't. Around mid-morning, 3 bikers roared into Harriet's driveway, engines thunderous and menacing. Bravo barked furiously inside the cabin, clawing at the door as Harriet stood on her porch, arms folded across her chest. The men didn't even bother to kill their engines. They revved them in a show of intimidation, dust swirling around their wheels. One of them, a brute of a man with braided hair and a thick scar on his cheek, hollered over the noise. "We hear you chased off one of our brothers last night. That's not friendly, lady." Harriet maintained her composure. "He was trespassing," she said, pitching her voice to carry over the rumble of the bikes. "I gave him a fair warning." Scarcheek's lips curled into a sneer. "Well, we don't take kindly to folks pulling guns on us. Maybe you should apologize. Show you're willing to make nice, or we'll have ourselves a problem." Just then, Bravo managed to push the door open with a firm nudge. The dog bounded onto the porch, teeth bared, hackles raised. The bikers exchanged wary glances, momentarily thrown off by the imposing canine. Harriet allowed herself a small, tight smile. She didn't need to brandish her weapon when Bravo's presence was enough to make them think twice. "I'm not apologizing for protecting my land," Harriet said firmly. "You want to start trouble in Greystone Junction, you'll find out real quick that folks around here don't scare easy." Scarcheek revved his engine in frustration, glaring daggers at Harriet. "We'll see about that. You might think you're tough, old lady, but you ain't seen what the Iron Runners can do." With that, the trio of bikers peeled off her property, leaving swirling dust in their wake. Harriet remained on the porch, heart pounding as Bravo growled at the spot where they'd been. The encounter solidified her resolve. The Iron Runners were escalating fast, and Harriet couldn't fend them off alone forever. They'd undoubtedly return in greater numbers, with more vicious intent. She needed a plan. She contacted Sheriff Mulligan and explained the morning's confrontation in detail. The sheriff promised to send a deputy out to take a statement, but Harriet could sense the strain in his voice. He had no real manpower to counter an entrenched gang, and the roads leading into Greystone Junction were so spread out that the bikers could choose multiple points of entry. There was no easy way to cordon off the entire town. By afternoon, Harriet found herself back at the cabin, devising a more systematic strategy. She mapped out vantage points and chokeholds on her property, locations where she could place motion detectors or even set up rudimentary barricades if necessary. She also considered the layout of Greystone Junction itself, from the abandoned depot to the narrow back roads leading into farmland. It occurred to her that if the bikers set up a base, they'd do so at a site with enough space for all their bikes and easy access to the main highway. The old depot seemed an obvious choice. With pen in hand, she sketched a rough battle plan. Maybe she could funnel the bikers into a trap if they decided to come after her again. She also jotted down code words and signals to use with Bravo, ensuring the dog knew exactly when to engage and when to hold back. Harriet was well aware of how vital timing and element of surprise could be. She ended the day by double-checking her gear, from her sidearm to Bravo's harness. Tired but resolute, she stepped outside to watch the sun set, the sky painted in vivid oranges and purples. Despite the natural beauty around her, Harriet couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest. She had hoped for a peaceful retirement, but fate seemed to have other plans. Her only solace was that she had the training, the will, and the unwavering loyalty of a dog who had been through thick and thin with her. Together, they would face whatever came next. 2 nights later, the Iron Runners made their move. Around 1 a.m., Harriet woke to Bravo's urgent barking. The motion sensor lights blazed on, illuminating nearly a dozen figures moving through the trees, accompanied by the menacing growl of motorcycle engines idling on the road. From her bedroom window, Harriet counted at least 6 bikes and a handful of figures on foot. Her pulse hammered, but her mind was clear. This was the scenario she'd been bracing for. She grabbed her sidearm and rushed to the living room, Bravo at her heel. She flicked the switch on a small surveillance monitor connected to 3 discrete cameras she'd mounted on the property. Grainy footage showed shadowy shapes advancing toward the barn and others approaching the front porch. Some carried baseball bats, others had crowbars or pipes. The ringleader appeared to be Scarcheek, easily identifiable by the twisted scar running down the left side of his face. Harriet took a breath. This was going to be a coordinated defense, and Bravo was her key asset. She positioned herself near a corner window with a clear view of the driveway, then pressed a button on a remote that activated additional floodlights and triggered a loud alarm. The sudden burst of noise and light caused the intruders to recoil in surprise, buying her a few precious seconds. Just as she'd planned, Harriet directed Bravo toward the barn using a series of hand signals. The dog sprinted off, weaving through the darkness at the property's edge. Meanwhile, Harriet opened a window and fired a warning shot into the air, her voice carrying across the yard. "Leave now, or face the consequences." Most of the bikers paused, startled by the gunshot. Scar Cheek, however, bellowed a command. The group surged forward, dividing their forces between the barn and the front porch. Harriet's heart raced, but her training took over. She darted to the back door, determined to protect her flank. From the cameras, she saw two bikers attempting to break into the barn. She knew Bravo was waiting, concealed in the shadows. Moments later, she heard a piercing yelp. Glancing at the monitor, she saw Bravo leaping onto one of the men, pinning him to the ground. The other swung a crowbar wildly, but the dog evaded the blow with agile speed. Harriet allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Bravo was doing exactly what he had been trained to do: isolate and neutralize threats. Meanwhile, three bikers started up the porch steps. Harriet positioned herself behind a sturdy, overturned table she had placed earlier for cover. One of the men smashed a window, but Harriet didn't flinch. She called out, "I don't want to hurt you, but I will defend myself." A volley of curses was her only reply. One biker lunged through the broken window, attempting to climb inside. Harriet fired a round into the wall above his head. Another warning shot. He dropped down, face pale, scrambling back to the porch. The second man tried to yank open the front door, but Harriet had bolted it shut with heavy reinforcements. They began to realize she was no easy target. In the distance, she could hear Bravo's fierce barking mixed with the startled shouts of the intruders who had gone for the barn. The orchestrated chaos was exactly what Harriet had planned. Split the gang, keep them off balance, and strike with precision. Through the haze of shouting and the glare of floodlights, Harriet spotted Scar Cheek stepping forward, a pistol in his hand. Her stomach clenched. This was no longer idle intimidation. They were armed and ready for lethal force. Harriet steeled herself, focusing on her breathing, her sense of mission, her unwavering will to protect her home. Harriet braced for what she feared would be a lethal exchange. Scar Cheek aimed his pistol at her makeshift barricade, finger tightening around the trigger. Before he could fire, a booming command cut through the night. "Freeze! Greystone Junction! Sheriff's Department!" A moment later, blinding blue and red lights flared from the road. Sheriff Mulligan and his two deputies had arrived, guns drawn, their cruiser lights spinning in the darkness. The sound of sirens carried across the property, reverberating off the old barn. Several of the iron runners turned to look, momentarily torn between fighting and fleeing. Seizing the split-second distraction, Harriet darted away from her cover, sliding along the interior wall until she reached the opposite window. From there, she had a clear line of sight on Scar Cheek, who still gripped his weapon, rage twisting his features. Carefully, Harriet fired once, hitting the ground near his feet. He cursed and leapt back, realizing he was pinned between Harriet's marksmanship and the newly arrived law enforcement. Then came an eruption of noise. Deputies shouted for the bikers to drop their weapons. The bikers shouted in confusion, and Harriet signaled Bravo to disengage. The dog backed off from the two men at the barn, who scrambled to their feet, battered and disoriented. A tense standoff ensued as half a dozen armed bikers faced off against Mulligan, his deputies, and Harriet, who now stepped outside her front door with her sidearm aimed steadily. Scar Cheek spat on the ground. "You think we're just going to surrender? We got more men on the way. You can't arrest us all." Mulligan, his own gun unwavering, barked back, "Drop the weapon or you'll leave here in a body bag. This is your last warning." So, for a heartbeat it seemed like Scar Cheek might try his luck in a firefight. But he glanced around. His men were cornered, some visibly injured, and Harriet stood like a grim sentinel beside her dog, ready to put him down if he made a wrong move. Finally, with a snarl of frustration, he flung his pistol to the ground. One by one, the bikers followed suit, tossing aside their guns, crowbars, and knives. The deputies rushed in, handcuffing the iron runners in a flurry of terse commands. Bravo trotted back to Harriet, tail wagging in exhaustion and relief. She knelt to rub his ears, whispering a quiet thanks. Sheriff Mulligan approached, letting out a long breath. "Damn, Harriet, you really did a number on them. Glad we got here when we did." Harriet exhaled, the tension draining from her limbs. "Thank you for showing up," she replied. I had it mostly under control, but another minute or two, and we'd have had more than a few injured bodies on this lawn. Subramanian Mulligan nodded soberly. We'll be calling the state police. Get these guys out of here. This gang's part of a larger operation, and we want them locked up in a bigger facility than our little county jail. He studied Harriet for a moment, taking in the expertly arranged defenses and her calm composure. I think there's more to you than meets the eye, Harriet Saunders. She merely shrugged. I had some training, she said, standing up to her full height, and I have a good partner. She looked down at Bravo, who panted happily despite the recent chaos. Morning light began to creep over the horizon as the authorities took statements and led the battered bikers away in handcuffs. Townsfolk, awakened by the commotion, peeked from their windows or ventured out to the edge of Harriet's property. They gazed upon the aftermath, a battered barn door, scattered motorcycle parts, the flicker of blue and red lights swirling across the dusty yard. Whispers spread through the crowd about how Harriet and her dog had single-handedly fended off a dozen armed men until help arrived. By the time the scene cleared, Harriet felt a bone-deep exhaustion, but she also felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Greystone Junction would remain peaceful for another day, and the Iron Runners had learned the hard way that not everyone they bullied would crumble. She patted Bravo's head, murmuring, "Good job, buddy," as the sun finally broke free from the horizon, bathing her property in warm golden light. Sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of Harriet's cabin, revealing the remnants of the previous night's turmoil. A splintered barn door, deep tire ruts in the dirt, and small shards of broken glass scattered near her porch. Yet a sense of calm hovered in the cool morning air. Greystone Junction was no longer under immediate threat. The roar of motorcycles had faded, replaced by the distant hum of a farm truck rolling along the highway. Sheriff Mulligan returned at dawn with 2 deputies and a member of the state police, each surveying Harriet's property with solemn respect. The Iron Runners who'd stormed her land were facing serious charges, and the rest of their chapter had scattered once they realized their plans had crumbled. A few had been apprehended on side roads, while others fled the county line entirely. By now, word of their defeat had likely traveled ahead of them. Standing on her porch, Harriet watched the law enforcement vehicles come and go, each departure lessening the tension that had weighed on the community for weeks. At her side sat Bravo, tail thumping lightly against the weathered boards. The Belgian Malinois gazed across the fields, still keyed into every stray sound, a soldier, even at rest. Harriet reached down to scratch the dog's ears, a silent acknowledgement of all they'd endured together. By late morning, a trickle of townspeople ventured out to see if everything was truly over. Earl from the auto repair shop drove up in his tow truck. Matt from the diner brought coffee in disposable cups, placing one in Harriet's hands with a grateful nod. A few families, shyly at first, gathered near her fence to express thanks. "We owe you," an older farmer told Harriet, hat in hand. She simply shook her head, insisting that she'd done only what needed to be done. Still, the townspeople weren't easily swayed. They recognized courage when they saw it, and Harriet's stand against the bikers had become a local legend overnight. Children whispered stories about the retired trucker lady and her fearless canine companion, retelling every scrap of rumor as though it were a heroic tale. While the spotlight made Harriet uncomfortable, she had never sought fame. She was glad the Iron Runners had been thwarted before they could sink deeper roots into the town. Over the next few days, repairs began. Volunteers helped rebuild the barn door, while friends dropped off meals at Harriet's place. For her part, Harriet visited neighbors who lived on remote stretches of road, advising them on ways to secure their properties. She spoke with the sheriff about forming a more organized watch group, ensuring that if any new threat emerged, Greystone Junction would not be caught off guard again. Despite the renewed bustle around her cabin, Harriet found moments of stillness. Morning coffee with Bravo sprawled at her feet, the dog's presence steady and comforting. Sometimes she recalled her military days, those high-risk missions with a younger Bravo by her side. Though she had embraced retirement, life clearly had a different path in mind, one where she could continue serving as a guardian, protecting the quiet places that most people overlooked. On the final evening of that eventful week, Harriet stood at the edge of her porch, gazing out at the sunset. The sky blazed with streaks of orange and pink, mirrored in the dusty fields. Bravo nuzzled her hand, and she patted his flank. For the first time in a long while, she felt genuinely at peace. The Iron Runners had learned a hard lesson. Not everyone in a small town was powerless, and not all former truckers were just tired old hands. Some carried their fighting spirit and unwavering loyalty in every breath, ready to protect the place they called home. And so, Harriet Saunders, retired female trucker, military veteran, and steadfast partner to a remarkable K-9, stood watch over Greystone Junction, knowing that peace was never guaranteed, but always worth defending. The distant croak of a crow and the gentle hush of a breeze through the fields were her lullaby. In that fragile twilight, Harriet allowed herself to hope that, at least for a little while, the road ahead would be as serene as the golden horizon before her. Reflecting on every twist and turn, it's clear that Harriet's journey wasn't just about fending off a gang. It was a testament to resilience, unity, and quiet heroism. From setting up cunning defenses to Bravo's unwavering loyalty at her side, we watched as one determined individual protected her adopted hometown when few others believed it possible. In the end, it's not about having a background in the military or the most advanced gear. It's about heart, resolve, and the willingness to stand up for what's right. As we wrap up this adventure, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What part left you most inspired or surprised? Let's discuss and explore the lessons we can all take away from this courageous showdown. Don't forget to stay tuned for future stories. Your voice and your support mean everything to us.